Hello everybody and welcome to this ISO TC 283 webinar on managing the OH&S risks arising from climate change and climate action. While we are just waiting for people to join us, let us begin with a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. It is listen only, so you will not be able to speak verbally to the panelists. However, we do encourage you to participate via the Q&A function with questions and comments. We do want this to be interactive, so please don't wait until the end to submit any comments or questions. We'll do it throughout the webinar and introduce your questions as they arise in the right sort of place, hopefully. Do let us know if you have any technical difficulties using the same Q&A function. We have a technical team in the background who are there to help you and should be able to resolve your issues. This is a CPD recognised session, so please request your certificate via the feedback survey, which will be circulated after the event. Also, when you finish that survey, we will send you the slides that are shown today and access to the recording. This will also be available on demand for people who do not make it to the live event. Thank you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. My name is Sally Swindred. I am the Committee Manager for ISO TC 283, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Management Committee, and I'm a Lead Standards Development Manager for BSI, the UK's national standards body. Now, if I can ask Daniel, John and Martin to turn on their cameras, please. Fantastic. I'm going to go across all of you in the order you appear on the slide. So Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Sally, and hello to everyone. I'm Daniel Trildos. I work for the National Standards Body of Colombia, Econtech, and I've been involved in different matters around environmental management, and recently I was the chair of the Net Zero Guidelines, and I'm also the co-chair of ISO TC 207 on environmental management. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Daniel. Lovely to have you here. John, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Hi there, everybody. Good day to everybody, and thank you for inviting me on this panel. I'm the ISO chair of the committee that looks after the strategy for adaptation standards. That's SC7TG2. I've also been working in the adaptation field for the past sort of 20 years, and I work a lot with ISO, with SEN in Europe, and with BSI on adaptation standards. I also teach the subject as well. Thank you.
We're in good hands then, John. Thank you for joining us. Now, the other part of the occupational health and safety management piece of the puzzle, Martin, please.
Thank you, Sally, and hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Martin Cottam, the chair of ISO TC 283. I've been involved with OH&S standards development for over 25 years, both at national and international level. I chaired the BSI Mirror Committee and led the UK delegation during the development of ISO 45001, and after that became the chair of TC 283 when that committee was formed in 2018. My background's actually in major hazard risk assessment, originally in nuclear and oil and gas and shipping. Latterly, I've specialised increasingly in quality management and ended my 31-year career with Lloyd's Register, the International Classification Society and Certification Body, as the group's Technical Assurance and Quality Director.
Thanks very much, Martin. So let's launch into our debate for today. We tend to run out of time because we all have plenty to say, so I'm going to keep us moving on. So first of all, why is the climate crisis a health and safety issue as well as an environmental one? And I'm going to come to Martin first, please.
Thank you, Sally. Well, I guess simply put, Our world's climate is changing, and those changes are affecting the occupational health and safety risks to which workers are exposed. Organisations, of course, are also making changes to their operations to reduce their climate impact. And those efforts are likely to gather pace in coming years as we all transition to a low carbon economy. And those changes in operations and in ways of working also need to be managed from an occupational health and safety perspective.
Thank you, Martin. John, you mentioned you're the chair of the Strategic Committee for Climate Change Adaptation Standards. Do you agree that it's right under the London Declaration pledges, and you might want to say a little bit about that to explain to our audience, that other committees, not just the Environmental Management Committee, are looking at this type of issue and how it impacts their sphere of work?
Yeah, it's an expanding topic in many ways, adaptation to climate change and building resilience. And of course, the London Declaration looks at sort of factoring in climate action across the whole suite of ISO standards where that's relevant. And my sort of strategic committee has been looking at sort of the overarching horizontal standards, looking at adaptation planning. In fact, I chaired the working group that produced ISO 14090, which is on adaptation planning. And the framework there is probably quite useful to other technical committees in looking at the adaptation topic. Of course, being a horizontal standard, the sort of sector-specific work would need to be done with the expertise in the specialist areas, such as in Martin's TC, because we're not experts in every field in ISO TC 207 SC7, which looks at mitigation and adaptation. We need the support, and I think the TCs that are looking at adaptation need our support as well, because we have a tremendous amount of expertise in terms of hazards and what to do about those hazards. The other thing I would say as well, there is an urgency to adapt. We're not doing very well globally to reduce or even maintain global temperatures below 2 degrees. And the climate is changing more rapidly than the science suggested 5 years ago. So there's a rapid need to do something. We need that expertise from other TCs. We need to collaborate.
Thank you, John. And of course, that's why we're here. And we're very grateful that we are bringing committees together here in a way that we hope lots of other committees will work with your experts to help tackle this very urgent problem. Daniel, you were the chair of the new international workshop agreement, the Net Zero Guidelines, which will be launched at COP27 in early November. And this was a real example, wasn't it, of exactly what John's just been talking about, the need to bring in lots of different people together to collaborate, to stop working in our own little silos with our very narrow borders and actually be addressing this urgent situation together without being too protective of our own little areas. What else do you think we need to look at? Why is it so important for the ISO committees to collaborate, but also external stakeholders?
Yeah, Sally, I think it was, as you mentioned, the IWA example. It was how to collaborate with others, and as John was saying, also we have expertise from different groups in different technical committees, and we should be looking around that collaboration between different experts, and they give that expertise in their specific field. And also, as we are talking in that question, that climate crisis is not just an environmental issue, it is broader than that. I would say much more broader than environmental and OH&S. It's very broad, and we need to collaborate with those. And in the end, we here are expecting to produce tools for different stakeholders, tools as standards to be used by different stakeholders, and we cannot produce those in isolation and just thinking about what inside a particular group they think the world would need, and we need to listen to the other stakeholders. And that's also a view from ISO, where ISO is expanding and trying to collaborate with others and trying to listen to others what they need. And I think that's very important. And that was the clear example with the IWA, how we managed to communicate with others outside the ISO world, and that they're not familiar with the standard development, but they have the expertise and the knowledge. And it's very important to involve everyone to produce a document that would be used and that would be useful for the different stakeholders.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think, Martin, I'm going to come back to you with an additional question, if you don't mind. We've experienced, even in this very early stage of our own deliberations, some resistance to this considering of climate change in a specialism such as occupational health and safety management. We've also seen it in quality management. What would you say to our listeners on that, who are specialists in a particular field, but not necessarily on climate change or adaptation?
Well, I think, Sally, the key message is that need to collaborate. We can't ignore the fact that the climate's changing. The evidence is all around us, and it's creating risks which have to be addressed. And it's not reasonable and not appropriate, clearly, to stand well back and say, well, this is for environmental specialists to sort out for us. All of us who have a discipline specialism have the expertise relevant to that area, and we need to contribute that and be proactive indeed in taking action to make sure that in our specific discipline, we encourage those that we influence through our standards work to take prompt and effective action. But we can't do it alone, because none of us within other discipline committees have the levels of knowledge and expertise that our colleagues in the environmental committees have. And so it's really important that we work together and take some leadership in respect of our own disciplines, but not in an autonomous way which ignores the huge opportunity to get expertise and input from our colleagues who have the specialist knowledge around environment.
Thanks, Martin. If we can go on to the next slide, please. I would like to start mining John's knowledge to a degree. How do you see our changing climate and the actions we need to try and take to mitigate that and slow this climate change down and maybe reverse some of the worst effects? How do you see it affecting workers and people across the world in terms of health and safety?
That's really interesting. The problem with reversing the climate change, it's not going to happen. We're not into reversing climate change. We're locked into greenhouse gases causing changes in temperatures. So we need to think about how society adapts to this future climate with extreme storms, heat waves, and the like. In my particular field, I mean, most of my career has been in infrastructure, and that's railway infrastructure and flood risk management infrastructure. And the sort of challenges I see there for people working in those sectors is a lot of the work is carried out outdoors with heaps of protective equipment on, being worn by people, which gives them real sort of heat problems. And we need to adjust our processes to recognize heat stress affecting people and finding ways to reduce that stress on people that are working outside. But that's sort of just one sort of sectoral set of considerations there. People working in buildings where it's already hot, how do you actually bring them more comfortable conditions for working without compromising the net zero aspirations? We think about buildings, we think about bolting on air conditioning units as an adaptation effort, but hang on a minute, doesn't that require energy? Where's that energy coming from? So there's things like that we need to think of and balance out. We can't go on adapting because we can afford to. We need to think about sustainability and how we can adapt in a sustainable way. But there's another sort of issue I kind of sometimes pick up on with climate resilience, climate adaptation, we're looking at the impact of the environment on the organization. And many environmental specialists look at the impact of the organization on the environment. There's a different mindset. Adaptation and resilience building tends to be context specific, depending on the sector. Mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, is very sort of simplistic in some ways, and that might annoy people me saying that. But reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you can measure and manage them. When you're looking at a system that relies upon a workforce, then depending on how that system operates, the adaptation measures will be very context specific. And when I say system as well, I'm thinking about like my world of infrastructure. Transport depends on energy. Energy depends on transport. Maintaining all this kit depends on people being able to travel. How do we make sure that these people are working safely in a changing climate, which might be causing problems with access to sites, flooding? How do you make the safe access to a substation if it's all flooded? And we need that substation. Gales and winds bring down power lines. Sometimes we end up with gales and winds followed by flooding. So all these hazards need to be in the mix, and we need to think very quickly about how they're going to change very quickly and have measures in place to adapt and change their working practices to make sure people are safe and healthy when they're carrying out work in these fields. And I'm just speaking mainly from the infrastructure side. Infrastructure makes everything else sort of tick.
Thank you, John. That's really, really interesting. And I want to, you mentioned about context just then, and that it is going to be different for different people in different places, different circumstances. And this is something that we talked a great deal about in the development of the guidelines for net zero, Daniel. And particularly one of the big topics was the effect on emerging economies and vulnerable populations. How is it going to vary, do you think, for workers in different parts of the world?
I think as also John was saying, that there's the context is very important, and the environmental conditions are different in different parts of the world, and we have societies or countries or cities that are more prepared, that they have the knowledge, they have the resources, they have the infrastructure to adapt for that and to manage and to address those potential risks. But then you will have others that are not. And when we were talking with different experts in different parts of the world, they face different risks, and they face different conditions and things that are not in the same way for everyone. So I think, and of course, if you look at where developing countries are, most of them are in regions that would be more vulnerable to the effects of those for their geographical location and the topographic conditions and where they are located and things like that, and that will be very complicated for some of them. So I think, of course, they will be different. Of course, independently from where you are, you will have risks, but the way to address those and the way you adapt to those would be quite different from one region to another one. And also, as John was saying, this is a system, and you need to think about in that way. Of course, mitigation would be something important to do. We cannot forget about mitigation, but we have to face that we need to adapt. The things change. It's not like it's something coming. It's already here, and we need to adapt to that. And there are different conditions in countries to be able to adapt, and in emerging economies they will face more complicated ways sometimes, not only in resources but in conditions in general and in knowledge. And yeah, that would be an issue, and of course that will impact organizations, and that will impact the workers on that organizations.
Thank you, Daniel. And we've had a related question come in already. I'm glad to see this is going to be a participative audience. So, gentlemen, do be ready for questions you are not prepared for. Many industries operate in remote regions and may be the primary reason for the existence of a community. Climate change will therefore impact not only the industrial base, but also the supporting community. So there's a synergy there. Is it possible to look at these issues strictly from an OH&S perspective, for example, or does there have to be a collaborative approach between community and work? Now, I don't mind who answers that. Whoever's thinking fastest, do speak.
I'm thinking collaboration. I think a lot these days, I mean, we drafted an annex into ISO 14090 on climate adaptation planning that talked about using systems thinking as a way to scope adaptation planning. And one of the themes in that is that when you are an organization or a community or a manufacturer, there are things under your control that you can manage and control. And part of that will be the occupational health and safety of your staff. But there are things outside that boundary that impact upon your products, your activities or services. And some of that could be supply chain, some of it could be commuter routes bringing workers into the site. And the wider considerations there would be around things like the health of people, to my mind, coming to work in the morning after a bad night's sleep, for example, because of a heat wave, or people that can't get into work because roads or commuter routes are flooded. So anything that I see when I look at adaptation, indeed the framework in the ISO I mentioned, it talks about collaborating with stakeholders or interested parties who are the wider community outside what your organization is actually able to control. So my way of looking at working out what's important and who is involved involves that wider community and dialogue. I don't think you can do anything in terms of adaptation without having that dialogue if you're going to adopt a systemic approach to adaptation.
Thanks, John. I was trying to unmute the wrong person then, not myself. Apologies for that. I want to build on what you were just saying, Martin. What John has just said very much fits in with ISO management system standards and the concept of interested parties, relevant interested parties. And certainly in occupational health and safety management in ISO 45001, we are already aware and thinking about this wider impact, aren't we? So perhaps you could give us some examples of more foreseeable risks that will be occupational health and safety risks, but also potentially impacting the wider community, other people that the organisation may interact with in that kind of way that John was talking about.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Sally. And actually, just listening to John speak, yes, I completely agree that collaboration is going to be needed, and there needs to be consideration of those wider interfaces. I just temper that by certainly conscious of the concern I think that we have as a committee that perhaps organisations are not yet giving the attention to climate change in a context of occupational health and safety that they should. I think I'd also want to temper that message by saying, reinforcing John's point, there's a lot that is within the gift of the organisation to do for itself and for which it is responsible, because it has responsibility for the occupational health and safety of its workers. And so, the need to engage with others and to work collaboratively shouldn't be seen as a reason to wait for others to act. That's not the message at all. Organisations need to be acting on the OH&S issues and challenges and risks that are emerging. The fact that they need to do it, some of that in collaboration with others, doesn't detract from the responsibility or the urgency. talking about the effects, I mean, John again has talked quite a lot about that. You know, we immediately think of, I guess, about more extreme weather events and occurring more frequently. We immediately default, I think, to thinking about higher temperatures. John spoke about the risks of heat stress for those working outside. He also touched on infrastructure. Yes, more storms and floods causing damage to infrastructure and property, and at the same time creating risk and potentially causing harm to workers who are working in or on that infrastructure or in that property. But also, of course, you know, there's the potential for greater risk, significantly greater risk to those whose jobs it is to respond to such emergencies and indeed to repair the damage. We think of heat, but equally we should think of cold. You know, there are parts of the world where probably the biggest impact, I believe, is more likely to be the extreme nature of the winters. But then I wanted to sort of call out those more gradual effects of rising temperatures. And this is where, of course, there is an interface with the wider community, Sally, to the point in your question. Because, you know, changing temperature regimes in regions and countries will have an impact on things like the spread of infectious diseases, due in part to, you know, the changes in the spread of the infectious agents or the species which can transmit those infectious diseases to human beings. So, you know, there are a lot of things where, you know, the workplace is just a microcosm of what's happening to, you know, to the wider society in which the workplace exists, and we need to remember it's not all about sort of temperature effects or weather effects necessarily. Those issues around disease, for example, I think are probably on fewer people's radar than the extreme storms are at this point in time.
And if we can go on to the next slide, please. There is a belief amongst some organisations, some people in the world, that this is a future problem, and that, as we've already mentioned, that heat wave we had this summer, or those wildfires, or that huge storm, it's a one-off thing. We don't really need to worry about it. It's not going to happen again. They're once in a lifetime, we hear, once in 100 years. Except we know, if we're paying attention, they're no longer once in 100 years. They are happening more and more frequently, and we're already seeing it. So Martin, can you tell us a little bit more about the current situation? Are we seeing organisations managing these risks in the way we would expect them to manage other health and safety risks? Or are they putting them off?
Well, I'm far from convinced, Sally, that the necessary action is really being taken at this stage in many organisations. I've recently spoken with representatives of two of the major international certification bodies, who of course have a really good insight as to what organisations who have an occupational health and safety management system are doing, what they are considering within the scope of that system, how they're analysing their organisational context to drive the development of that occupational health and safety management system. And I was somewhat surprised that in both cases, I was told very clearly that in the experience of these organisations and these individuals, relatively few organisations are explicitly identifying climate change as a component of their organisational context at this time from an OH&S perspective. And yet, of course, ISO 45001 requires organisations to identify relevant factors which they need to take into account in their OH&S systems. So organisations that are certified are going through that exercise, but they are not emerging with climate change as one of the factors that they identify as relevant. And you know, perhaps even more surprising for me was that the certifiers told me that in their experience, many more organizations are considering climate change as part of context for their quality management systems than for their occupational health and safety management systems. And to me, that just doesn't really make a lot of sense, to be honest. And I think it strongly suggests to me that we need more awareness raising to remind people to consider the impacts of climate change on their occupational health and safety management, because as you said, Sally, I still think many organisations may be continuing to treat these extreme weather events as just one-off events rather than acknowledging that underlying trend and preparing accordingly.
Thank you, Martin. Daniel, have you got anything to add on this? I mean, John's already mentioned how the climate is changing much faster than was anticipated until very recently. And given what Martin has said, that actually organisations are being a little slower to respond than perhaps is sensible, and the issue is speeding up. What would your view be on what do we need to see organisations doing now?
Yes, Hallie, I think thinking about organizations and occupational health and safety, probably when you talk with them, and after I met with you and Martin some time ago, and you mentioned this work that you would like to produce here, I talked with different organizations here in Colombia and asked them. And in the very beginning, they said, no, we are not thinking about climate change, because they sometimes think this is just an environmental matter and we don't have, or we have the environmental management system, and that's part of that area, and we're not thinking about this. But then when they start thinking about it and continue thinking, they said, okay, yes, there will be impacts on the occupational health and safety of the workers of the organization, and that's something we should address. And I think creating that consciousness in organization that climate change will impact the occupational health and safety, and providing a tool for them to look at that would be something very interesting, because this is something that is happening right now. I think it shouldn't be a future concern. Probably they are not aware of what is going on and the impact that would have, but it's something that is happening right now. And when they started thinking about that, they realized how important would be to address in the context of the health and safety management system, to look at climate change as something very impacting for them. So I think it is happening now. It is important to address that now. I think also, and coming back a little bit on collaboration and what Martin was saying about the need of collaboration, but it's also important to be aware that just one document probably will not address everything, and we cannot wait until we have everything in place and produce one. We will not solve the issue with just one attempt. We need to work collaboratively, of course, but advance in the specific area we have, and continue giving that probably to other people and for organizations. So just to close this, I think it is happening now. It's something organizations should pay attention to. It's not in the future, and there's an urgency on that, of course, to work as fast as possible in that and to address this for organizations. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, and I'd like us to explore a bit more about what is likely to happen and how these risks are going to accelerate. John, you've already touched on it, and we've touched on what is happening now, and certainly in the last year there's been all sorts of catastrophic climate-related events that have affected people. We know that they are happening more frequently, but is that frequency going to accelerate as well as the nature of those events? We know that we aren't now going to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees by 2050, which was the ambition. What can you see as being likely to happen, even if we do start acting quickly, urgently on mitigation issues, what are we going to have to be dealing with? John?
It's one of these almost perennial questions these days. What are we going to have to deal with? Well, we've looked at the Paris Agreement, the 2016 agreement that looked at limiting global temperatures to an average of 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels, with a kind of effort to get down to 1.5. That's just not happening. But even with 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and we're around about 1.1, 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels now, even with that small amount as an average, look at the extremes you get with that. And there's some huge uncertainties about the extremes, but we are seeing increased frequency of events. I mean, some of the studies I've seen from about 15 years ago, I think, was saying in river basins in the UK, like the Thames and the Severn, and the Tay and the Forth up in Scotland, in those large river basins, the 100-year flood event will be a 15-year flood event by the 2080s. And that seems to be a kind of rule of thumb that can apply to things like coastal flooding and the like as well. So we're seeing an increase in frequency of these large events. We're also seeing an increase in energy. So some of the hurricanes and cyclones we've seen in other parts of the world have had more energy in them, because when the atmosphere is warmer, which is what's happening, there's more moisture, there's more energy in the atmosphere. So we're seeing more extreme storms. We're seeing heat waves causing, like Martin was alluding to, sort of changes in disease patterns, changes in vegetation, species dying out. These are things we're going to see in the next 100 years. And it's all change. We need to recognize that change and get our plans in place to adjust. And this will mean not only species migrating, but people, and shortages of water, and immigration and migration across the globe. These are things that are going to happen, because we cannot put the climate back to what it was 10 years ago, 50 years ago. Temperatures are going to keep rising for centuries. Sea level is going to keep rising for centuries. And we, as humans, have got a short lifespan, relatively. We need to try and start to accelerate the mitigation, stopping greenhouse gas emissions, net zero, but we need to urgently adapt to these new conditions. Okay, 1 degree, 2 degrees doesn't sound much, that's an average, but the extremes, if you think of a distribution curve, the extremes at the end are going really extreme compared with what we've experienced in the past.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about, isn't it? As habitats become less livable and people migrate, that is really going to affect not only our communities and how we are living together, but the kind of work we do, how we do it. Different jobs are going to arise and other jobs will become extinct, because the world will be changing in that way. Martin, have you got any tips for our audience? Anything they can do to prepare for, over the next 100 years, there's going to be whole scale change from what we can understand, what I can understand. I may have that wrong, but I'm getting the impression it's going to be big changes. Is there anything we can do to start preparing?
Well, I'm not sure I can offer tips for the next century, Sally. That's perhaps a little overambitious. So it would be on my part to attempt it. But I echo some of what you were saying. I mean, I was listening to what John was saying, and that focus, the huge challenge of living with climate, the extent of climate change, which is now inevitable, and the challenge then of managing the OH&S effects of that change to protect workers. But you also mentioned the other side of that, which I've been thinking about too, which is that as organizations work to reduce their own contribution to global warming and work towards net zero, that will mean changing the way they operate, stopping some activities, changing others. And there's potential in any of those changes for new OH&S risks to arise. So we need to be proactive in identifying and addressing those risks as part of a change management process. But you know, then we get to the more macroscopic effects that some industries may contract significantly while others grow and new industries emerge. And of course, that new creation of new jobs in the net zero economy will imply that for many workers, they may see a quite dramatic change of career within their working lifetime, working between sectors. Indeed, some of the things John was saying reminds us, of course, that they may also physically relocate, need to relocate to a completely different part of the world and work in a part of the world with which they're unfamiliar, which may bring with it challenges around a different OH&S culture, different OH&S legislative regimes and the like. And so there are a lot of challenges then for us as OH&S professionals in organisations in coping with the extent of that change and making sure that health and safety of those workers who may be new to our sector, new to the geography, new to the type of activity, that their OH&S is properly managed as they are recruited, inducted, supported in their new roles, because these will not be the kind of workers we have employed in the past. And therefore, the way in which we manage them from an OH&S perspective will need to take that into account.
And before you finish, Martin, as you were talking, I was thinking about a conversation I had earlier today with a young worker who was saying she seems to be living in a world where half of the working population are currently in existential crisis. They are stressed, they are anxious, and it is affecting their work, whilst they are working with people who are denying there is a problem and don't want to do anything at all because it's not their business. And I would just like to touch on this psychological health and safety aspect, please, because we've been talking a great deal about the physical effects, but the mental health side of it is also something to plan for and prepare for, is it not?
It absolutely is, Sally, and I think, if there's one tiny thing for which we can be grateful about the last 2 or 3 years of a global pandemic, it's the fact that it has made it so much more acceptable, legitimate, that we talk openly about psychological health, and in particular that we are prepared and comfortable to do that in the workplace. So I think we've come some way down a road which began with this being essentially a taboo subject in many organizations and for many people, and in consequence of that being relatively poorly addressed by many organizations. So I take some hope from the fact that we have moved in a direction where there's more recognition of these challenges. But you're right, if we ever thought this was only about the pandemic, we were deluding ourselves. We should have known that anyway, because in fact the underlying trend in worker psychological health has been a deteriorating trend long before the pandemic came. And so there's no reason really to expect, that problem to have gone away anyway. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the world in which we are living, with its, with the increased vulnerabilities and fragility that we're all experiencing, it is a stressful place, and that will carry into the workplace inevitably. And the effects are also felt in the workplace because the workplace is itself experiencing the effects of climate change, and so it's very unsettling for everybody. And of course, a compounding factor in many ways in terms of the complexity of this is also that we have one of the widest age ranges now in the working population that we have ever had, and that's also likely to increase as retirement ages again push ever upward, and we have both very young workers in the workplace and much older workers. And that really brings home for me the need for organizations to remember that a working population is not homogeneous, and the needs and expectations of workers of different generations, for example, are quite different and have to be treated as such and managed as such. So yeah, we've a lot to do, I think, in the area of psychological health, and it's not going to get easier, sad to say.
And one of the things that we can do to manage worker psychological health, safety and well-being is very much about planning and taking control, is it not? Uncertainty leads to anxiety, leads to mistakes. So what we're doing today and exploring these things, asking organisations to think about it, put preparations in place, is part of that addressing your worker psychological health and safety, in as much as the more we know, the more prepared we are, the less anxious we are for it. And I have a question here, but sorry, go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, and that's true, absolutely true, Sally, but I think we also should call out that there's also a link between psychological health and physical health and safety. You know, when we manage workers' psychological health better, we're also contributing to a reduction in those physical incidents and accidents, because it's people who are stressed, people who are exhausted, you know, people who are worried, unsettled, distracted, who make mistakes which give rise to physical consequences, either to themselves or to others around them in the workplace. And so, you know, it's a win-win to tackle this proactively, because you're not just improving psychological health, you're improving health and safety, full stop.
Yeah, absolutely. John, we've had a question come in from the audience for you. How can we prepare students currently studying engineering to be prepared to design and build the systems and infrastructure we're going to need to adapt to climate change? And this, of course, also has a bearing on the health and safety aspects. If we're building it well, we should have less risks.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm actually actively involved in that. I'm working at universities of Birmingham, University of Surrey, both as a visiting professor, looking at the curriculum for engineering to try and align that curriculum with the need for teaching resilience and adaptation, and aligning the curricula with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But Birmingham has got the advantage there in some ways, in that it has 450 students a year that join its engineering courses. So over the sort of 5 years that we're working on that, that will make a change to a small part of the engineering community. But yes, we really need to get this topic of resilience and adaptation and occupational health and safety into things like the engineering curriculum, so that our future engineers know how to design things with resilience built in and things that are easily maintainable. And I said earlier, much of my career was in railways and flood risk management. Well, the detail of that was much of those careers was in maintaining old infrastructure, which brought with it its own hazards, with railways and trains at 100 odd miles an hour, and river control structures with water flowing by at a great rate. It makes you rather humble to look at what you're dealing with in terms of maintaining these systems. But yes, we do need to have a sea change, I think, in the way that we teach people and educate people into building resilient design. And to be quite honest, and if you have another afternoon, I could go into economics theories behind investment in infrastructure and maintaining infrastructure and so on, but this isn't the place for that. But the one thing I would put over is that we need to get our engineers and our organizations to think about added value and not the cost of doing something, because cost is always a barrier. And there's this word that I keep coming across, or phrase that I keep coming across, called "it's too expensive." Well, if an organization thinks it's too expensive to build in resilience into an infrastructure system just now, well, I'd like to speak to them again in 5 years' time to see if they've cut costs and made something efficient for normal conditions as they understand them, compared with future conditions as we know that are going to come. So it's a mindset thing. It's let's train our organizations, let's have the conversations to change that mindset to look at value rather than cost. because if you look at engineering infrastructure with future value in mind, it puts you in a different place. Sorry, it's one of my hobby horses. Like I said, I could spend an afternoon talking about that.
Perhaps our questioner spotted you and knew that they wanted to get you talking on it, John. I think that's very likely. We're getting a lot of questions through, which is slowing down our time a little bit, so bear with me. And if you can't answer the question, that's fine. We'll take it offline and we'll get an answer for our participants. But I do want to ask as many of them as I can. Daniel, what do you think are some initiatives that can be utilised to support and promote adapting to climate change with a relationship to OH&S? What kind of things would you suggest organisations should do now, could start with?
Well, I think first of all, they need to be aware of that. Some of them, they're not even looking at climate change as an issue for them, as an occupational health and safety issue. And I think that would be something very important to create that awareness within organizations. And then, of course, they will continue with that and we'll look at that. But I think one very first step for that, I don't know, other initiatives and things that could be done, but at least to make them aware that climate change is something that will affect the health and safety of their workers, and they will start thinking about that. That's at least one very first step, of course.
And I have a related question for you, Martin, kind of building on what Daniel's saying. Yes, first of all, you need to know there's a problem. We can't address the problem if we're not recognising there is a problem. But one of our audience members has asked, do organisations have enough evidence-based studies or solutions to know what adaptations are effective? And also, are those adaptations going to have to be different for different groups of workers, for vulnerable groups of workers, for the very young, for the older, for people with disabilities? There's a whole range of things, cultural differences, religious, ethnic differences, particularly if we're moving around the world into places where we aren't used to being. How much are organisations going to have to look at that adaptation for different groups of workers in this space?
Well, I think they are going to have to do that, Sally. And you know, I look at ISO 45001 with its strong emphasis on, if you like, the collaborative nature of OH&S in organizations, the involvement, the participation in decision making by workers. And that's emphasized, you know, for good reason. And it's partly because the organization, if by that you mean the top management, can't be expected to have all the answers or even to be alert to all the issues that its the full diversity of its workforce might entail. And so I think that's where it's so important to be open to discussion, collaboration, exploration together, in order that the organizations can learn from the collective experience and knowledge of an entire team, rather than expecting that OH&S is something which is done to workers by managers or done for workers by managers. It's not obviously like that at all. So yes, I think there is that challenge. It's there always, of course, in OH&S. If we haven't recognized it adequately in the past, then we need to do that anyway, frankly, irrespective of climate change. With more diversity in the workforce, we need to be responsive to that diversity and listening to and understanding people's needs. So I think it just accelerates a trend, which I think is already underway, to be very honest. I was just going to make one other point, if I may, which again is a kind of collaboration point, but so many organizations operate integrated management systems, and certainly many organizations which are grappling with the issues we're discussing today in respect of OH&S will have environmental expertise. They may well have environmental management systems within their organization. And I think, there's even a tendency at times within organisations to something of a silo behaviour between the quality team, the environmental team, and the OH&S team, or at least that can exist. And I think this conversation is a really powerful example of where conversations that bring all those voices into one room and one conversation are going to produce much better results than having people grappling with these issues in isolation, and the quality function being proactive in recognizing that climate change is an issue for the organization and its risks, but the OH&S team being a little bit more reluctant or hesitant or hasn't really got around to doing it. So I think that a joined up approach within the organization is also really valuable.
Absolutely, and that very much relates to one of our earliest questions about building occupational health and safety into environmental sustainable governance, ESG initiatives and managements in an organisation. And of course, it's a conversation we are having within the ISO community quite a lot at the moment, in that there are strategic groups looking at ESG, there's strategic groups looking at risk and at climate change. We know all these things are interrelated, but somehow still we sit in separate rooms rather than all sitting in the same room to discuss how we deal with it. So perhaps we can all take that lesson away and make sure we do keep all listening to each other and exploring each other's expertise to come to the best solution in a holistic way, rather than putting up better flood defences because it might flood, whilst not really thinking about the contaminants that might be coming in with that dirty water, for example. Very simple example. Let's go on to the next slide, please. ISO TC 283, the Health and Safety Committee, is proposing guidance on OH&S risks related to climate change. So can we focus in a little bit more on what we want to do, why we want to do it? Martin, please.
Yes, thank you, Sally. So what we're envisaging as the most suitable type of document that we might produce here is probably a publicly available specification, or a PAS as they tend to be known. So this is a guidance document. Listeners may already be familiar with one such document that our committee, TC 283, has already produced, and that was ISO PAS 45005, our safe working guidelines for the COVID-19 pandemic, which we developed at pace in the early months of the pandemic, publishing in I think just about 3 months from the initial meeting of the working group. Now, that said, on this occasion, we wouldn't be proposing perhaps such an accelerated timeline. I think we would plan for a 6-month development, beginning at the start of next year and hopefully publishing in the middle of the calendar year. The key thing, I think, with any work around awareness raising and so on, is to get the right stakeholders and the necessary expertise involved in the work. And that's why I'm so delighted that Daniel and his colleagues in ISO TC 207, Environmental Management, have agreed to collaborate with us in this work. And given that, frankly, every country across the globe is affected by climate change in different ways, I very much hope that all national standards bodies will want to participate in this work, and that we will really have a significant involvement and expertise from every corner of the world.
So on the screen now, there is a very rough, very early version of a potential scope for this new document that we are talking about. Daniel, Martin has already mentioned the collaboration, the liaison with ISO TC 207, the Environmental Management Committee. How do you think this might work? I mean, TC 207 is a big committee with many, many parts and many experts in it. How do you think this will work best?
Well, I think we of course, as TC 207, we have the environmental management community in there and expertise, and I'm sure from different SCs, they would be very interested in this work. But also we have TC207 SC7, where the experts in climate change are. And of course, there's a need of that collaboration and to have that expertise in there. I would say we need to explore how to better collaborate. It's difficult to say this is the best way, because I was talking with Sheila, she's the chair of TC207, and with our committee manager, and there's of course the interest of TC207 to collaborate with other groups and try to expand that collaboration, not thinking about we work in silos, but to work collaboratively and thinking not about our specific TC or our standards and documents, but thinking about who are the users of the documents that we produce, and they, I think they are not interested in knowing who the specific TC is producing something. They see this as an ISO standard, as an ISO pass, as a document that is produced by experts, and each group should provide that expertise. And that's something we should explore between 283 and 207, how to better collaborate in this and to find the best way to do it. But I would say also probably, and I'm seeing here the term risks in different places and things, and there's also a specific TC about risk management, and probably they have also that expertise in there. So probably the collaboration is not just between 283 and TC207 SC7, but broader collaboration with other TCs. And it is very important that in the very beginning we find a way on how that collaboration would be done, because from experience that we had in the past with different other documents, if we have not that clear in the very beginning, that then some administrative issues could come in the process, and there's a matter of urgency here, and that's something that should be done, and those administrative issues should not be in the way of producing something that the world really needs and that would be important for organizations, and to address those concerns. So I think that that's something we should begin as soon as possible to find that way to explore how that collaboration would be, and to be very clear with the members, of course, because we've been talking about the leadership of the two TCs, but in the end, the TC is the members of those TCs, and we need to of course talk with them and find which would be the better way to have that collaboration. But I think it is very important to have that collaboration.
Thank you, Daniel. And you've picked up on so many things. I don't even know where to start with this. Certainly, in our initial discussions, we have talked about bringing in risk experts. We've talked about bringing in governance experts. And I think, you know, the point that really came to me when you were speaking is we've got to act for the greater good. It doesn't matter what labels we put on it. It doesn't matter who is the named chair or who is owning a piece of work that the users urgently need. This is fundamental to ISO's spirit, that we collaborate for the greater good. And I think that is very much what we want to do in this space. So we absolutely do want inputs. We want everybody's input. We want to know what people are worried about. We want to know what we should do, what the risks are, what the different considerations that we should be thinking about are. And John, you can see the proposed scope on the screen. Does it look right as a starting point for you? Are we missing something? Are we going in the wrong direction? What are your views?
I think it's a great start, because one of the things I keep coming back to, and some of my colleagues that might be on the call will know this phrase I keep using, it's better to have a document that's broadly in the right area than something that's precisely wrong. So we're heading on a journey here, and we need to have something out there to respond to the urgency of adaptation. But the one thing that I'm picking up, one thing I'm seeing here, and this is from some work I've been doing over the past few weeks actually, is that we could really do with some examples in what we do, like a PAS, in any standard really, to say this is how this is applied. And I'm thinking, are there case studies out there that can say, okay, these are some of the challenges we have. And by the way, here's 3 case studies showing how people have done this, how they got over these challenges. 3, I just picked that number off the top of my head. But it's one of those things that if people see that they can do something, refer to something and say, oh, so-and-so has done it this way, and that's really helpful. The other thing is that that I would pick up is this has got to be some sort of generic document that is, again, a horizontal standard, because once you get into organizations that are so context specific, and what is right for a forestry might not be right for a factory making concrete components. So the context side of it is quite important. I must apologise, Sally, because I have actually got a lecture to give to my students from 2 o'clock. So I was only sort of booked for the sort of hour from 1 till 2 here. And I hope you don't mind. If there's any other questions for me, I'm glad to take them up offline, but I'll have to disappear now. But this has been really great because it's building adaptive capacity just by having how many 56 people attending this. You know, if each one of them has a conversation with 2 people, you're starting to build a momentum, and let's collaborate.
John, we're really grateful you came. We know how busy you are. Thank you ever so much for your contributions. I hope we can do this again. I think one of the things we've suggested we do to kick this work off is have maybe a half-day workshop with anybody who wants to come to explore all these ideas, get those examples out, get those questions out. So I do hope you'll join us for that. And have a good lecture.
Thank you. Bye
Take
for
care.
now. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sally, can I just pick up on some of the points that Daniel made earlier? Because I think you made the point, Daniel, that, you know, for a good collaboration, you need to set yourself up for success. And I think one of those elements is to be very clear about the scope of work. We've been socializing this scope of work that's now on the screen with a number of people, and already have some learning, I think, from it, even from the TC283 plenary meeting, which took place yesterday, and some other sources. And I think we will, for example, have learned that we need to really try and clarify what the scope of the document is. And I think every time the word risk appears in here, we need to remind ourselves, and probably should write it into the text at some stage, Sally, it's OH&S risk. Every mention of risk in you know, bullet 2, bullet 3, and in the chapeau, we need to remind ourselves, partly because otherwise I think if we do get into that collaboration and that's not clear to people, there could be some tension around, well, why aren't you considering this? Surely it says risk, there's a lot of risks here. Well, actually, we're focused on the OH&S risks. You're muted, Sally.
I know. After I spoke, I knew. And yeah, and one of our audience members has said, surely it's important to start by providing guidance on hazard identification with regard to OH&S risks arising from climate change. You're absolutely right. We need to be very specific here on what we're trying to cover. TC283 and no other single committee is going to be able to write a quick document on risks from climate change. They are very broad and they touch everything. So yes, in answer to your question, our audience member, yes, you're right. OH&S hazard identification in this space is going to be a very important part of this work that we carry out. There was something else I was going to ask you, and it was now gone. The examples point that John was bringing up, and balancing that with it being a generic horizontal standard. Now, this is a challenge that we talk about quite a lot in our technical committee. We are well aware that if you do not write explicit language and give explicit guidance and signposting to specific things, they don't always get seen by people. And yet, as one of our questioners says, surely the context is going to be very different everywhere. So how do we do that? Martin, can you explain a little bit about what the approach in TC 283 is and what we would try to do in this document also in terms of examples, accessibility, inclusivity?
Yes, certainly, Sally. Our approach is very much informed by some research which ISO carried out across a number of standards, but it happened to include our own standard, ISO 45001. And what that revealed to us rather unexpectedly was that many of the phrases that we used in our documents that were relatively general phrases meant to be all-encompassing were proving for users to be too vague, too general, and effectively the points that we were trying to get across were being missed. And I think that the classic example of that for us has been the phrase considering the needs of all workers. And very often in the early drafts of our standard, we had very specific examples saying consider the needs of people with disabilities, people, older workers, younger workers, and we have 3, 4, 5, 6 more examples of what we meant. And then in the interests of a more elegant, efficient looking text, we were persuaded that we didn't need these phrases repeated all through the standard, and we should just have something simple which said consider the needs of all workers. Women, of course, being another important part of the workforce, which sometimes their needs need to be called out because they don't get properly considered. And we ended up publishing a document which didn't call any of these out. It had these very generic phrases. And the evidence in implementation was that organizations didn't really recognize what we were saying. And so that informs a lot of what we're doing now in terms of recognizing the need to give specific examples. The problem is then that if you're trying to cover every context, you can end up with what I would term in English a laundry list of examples. It goes on forever. And the danger with that is people then think that our list is exhaustive. Those are the only things. There's 28 things in the list, and there are only 28 things to consider. And of course, the message in everything to do with management systems is that context is king. That the prescription that a management system standard provides is there to be adapted and applied within the context in which the organization operates. And trying to take something off the shelf that has been applied in a different context is a recipe for failure. So it's always a balancing act for us to provide some examples, enough to perhaps, diverse examples to stimulate thinking, not enough to give the impression they're exhaustive, but they need to be specific examples, not just general references to, considering the needs of all workers. Those are the sorts of issues I think you were referring to, Sally, I hope.
Yeah, well, it's this balance, isn't it? As you say, give illustrative examples, but also don't try and imply that you're covering everything. And to John's point about, if you're, I don't know, a chemical manufacturer, you will have the same risks as a corner shop in a city or a farm in Southern Africa. They're very different places, they're very different contexts, to your point, and we need to make sure we speak to all of them. And Daniel, I'd like to bring you in here. Part of the net zero guidelines conversation, which caused quite a lot of friction at times, was writing accessibly, writing in a language that climate non-experts, ordinary people who also need to act, would understand. I'd be interested on your views on that in terms of health and safety and other generic climate related documents that may get developed in the future. How important do you think it is that we write documents that anybody can pick up as opposed to documents for experts? Is there a place for both? What's our role in that?
I think there should be a place for both, because in the end, of course, documents will be used by people that need to know something about that. It's not a textbook that would teach things necessarily, but they have to be written in an accessible language that anyone with some kind of knowledge in what they're doing can understand the standards and the documents. And that's on something we've been exploring, particularly here in Colombia. We've been talking about that, not just for the climate change documents, but for all our documents, because many of our stakeholders are saying your documents are completely difficult to understand, even for experts. And even if they are experts on that, they cannot understand the standards. And standards should be written in a more accessible language for people to understand. And that was something that happened with the net zero guidelines, because we have sometimes two worlds in there. The standards development experts that would like to have those definitions very clear in their technical terms, and each term could be completely changed, the whole definition, when you have that expertise. But then when a common normal people outside the world of standard development look at the document and see the definition, they find that very difficult to understand. And that's something that we also, and that when developing standards, we have to be aware of and balance that, of course, because they need to have technical terms, they need to be clearly defined, but they need to be understandable by anyone. And sometimes we have, and I don't know if that happened in 283, but other documents, you see a definition, and then you have like 6 or 7 notes trying to explain the definition. That's something wrong with the definition. If you need a lot of notes to explain that, and then you read the notes, and in the end you will not understand sometimes. So the language is very important. It will cause friction, of course. It happened with the net zero guidelines, and we have like the people who wanted to keep the definition as it was in another standard. That's very important. You have to be aligned with that. Of course, you cannot contradict other definitions. But other stakeholders were saying, try to say this in a more friendly way that can be understood by non-experts. And of course, another important part in here is who are you, who will be your audience of the document, and think about that audience. In the net zero guidelines, we were trying to address audience that were not experts in net zero and trying to give them some tools in there, and that's something very important here, because if you use some language for some audience, could be difficult. So that's another thing to balance when you are producing the document, of course.
Thanks, Daniel. And I think, Martin, the ambition is to provide a high-level document that anybody can understand and use it to start making effective and practical changes in their organisations to better protect their workers, no matter what they do, whether they're a small organisation or a huge organisation. So this is something, again, I believe that we're going to be trying very hard to do, to make this a generic document that non-experts can get value from, whilst perhaps signposting to other documents with more technical information. Is that the approach you foresee us taking?
Yes, it is, Sally, and picking up on the remark Daniel made of experience in his committee, I think for me the issue of getting the language right and the question of who is our audience is a real challenge for us as an occupational health and safety committee, because if you look at the demographics, as it were, of organizations where are workers employed across the global economy, the vast majority of workers are employed in small and micro organizations, not in large corporations. And so, and it's those smaller organizations which very typically will not employ a professionally trained OH&S professional it will be a role which is taken on by somebody else in the organization who will, to a certain extent, learn as they go. So, for us to have global impact as a standards writing committee, we have to be writing documents which are valuable to small organizations which don't have huge in-house OH&S expertise, because otherwise we're talking to a tiny subset of workers in the global economy who work for large corporations who very probably employ OH&S professionals who could sort all this out for themselves without reference to our standards. So but it is a real challenge, because a lot of the established ways of writing standards and the core common text which we use in documents has a degree of formality. I think recent discussions have persuaded me that probably the bigger challenge is actually what committees individually do in adding to the core text which sits at the heart of our standards, and that in the process of adding we overcomplicate. But it's certainly a matter on which A, we need vigilance, and B, where participation of people in the process who will call this out and help us spot, hang on, you're doing it again, it's getting too complicated, I don't understand it. That's really where I think participation through the commenting process and so on can really help us to get this as good as we can.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And let's come back to the core of this subject. There are risks to workers arising from climate change in terms of occupational health and safety, and to those other interested parties, as we have discussed, people who interact with those organisations, who are affected by their activities, who live nearby, for example. And no matter how fast we develop this document that we are currently proposing, it is going to take a little bit of time, and yet these effects are already being felt. At some part of the world right now, something is going on that will be affecting people, that is climate related, that will put people working at a health or safety risk. So can we think, and particularly let's think about those smaller organisations, because we haven't really talked about them very much today, but they are just as vulnerable as everybody else. We can't pretend that 90% of the world's organisations aren't there, and it's only the big ones we need to worry about. What practical advice could you give to, say, a 10-person organisation today to start planning and putting in controls against potential occupational health and safety risks related to climate? Where would you start, Daniel?
Thanks, Sally. Well, I don't really know what practical guidance could be given to organizations. They are facing right now the issues and the risks. They are trying to do it the best way they can. I think there are already some documents that would help, of course, but sometimes they are scared to use or to use that, or sometimes they do not have that practical information that I think would be the purpose of the document that it's planned to be produced. Because if you look at 45,001, you will have the context, and in general you should be looking at that. But organizations are not doing that sometimes because they don't see it. So I think something important is to be aware of what is happening, and to try to see that. And they are seeing that organizations, even small organizations, they know that there are floodings, that there are droughts, that there are different consequences from climate change, and they need to do something, to think about how, and to talk probably with their employees to see what's happening with them. In the psychological part you were mentioning before, and we talked about that before, there's a big effect. Sometimes you cannot see easy when you have the organization trying to look what's happening with the employees, what's happening with them, with the workers, how it's affecting them, and trying to take measures to be as flexible as possible. And yeah, that's something I think you can do just at the very beginning. But probably the best thing is that we try to produce this as fast as possible so that we can produce that guidance and for them. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot there, not being a health and safety expert, but I think you are partly getting to the point. Let's talk to each other. Let's be more aware. Let's actually think about it. Is a step. That is something we can do today. Martin, any practical tips or guidance you would give organisations?
Well, I think Daniel's said some of the most important things, to be honest. I'd really just want to encourage all organisations, if they've not already done so, to start thinking now about the implications of climate change. Yes, I hope our document will help, and I hope it'll be produced soon, but I'd still urge that organisations start now. We can't continue treating the extreme weather events that we're experiencing as one-off things and just thinking we'll react if it happens. So we just need to get into that proactive mind frame of recognizing here is a pattern, these events are here to stay, they're going to get more frequent and they're going to get more severe. And we need to start thinking about putting arrangements in place ahead of those recurrences. And I think Daniel's absolutely right. You start from, whether it's a brainstorming in the management team or whether it's a brainstorming with workers, and particularly, of course, I think younger employees very often are following with great interest the whole issue of the environment and the climate, and actually have, perhaps a great deal more knowledge of what these effects are or are likely to be than perhaps some people of my generation. So there will be quite a lot of information available within the organisation to discuss what do we know about what's likely to be the effects on us, plus those killer questions of what have we already experienced and what can we extrapolate from that? What have we seen other organisations, similar organisations, what are they thinking about? And of course, this is not a competitive topic. This is the sort of topic which can be openly discussed and shared, in trade organisations and in local business forum and those kind of things, where you can exchange ideas with other companies or organisations in your locality who may also obviously be vulnerable to the same climate effects and may already be on the journey to think about them.
Thank you very much, Martin. And we are basically out of time. So I would just like to give a plea to our audience today to remember that we in TC 283, Daniel and his colleagues in TC 207, we are here to help. We are here for our users, not for any other reason. We're here to help our users resolve problems, get good guidance. So do get in touch with us. Have a look at our website, see the resources that are on there. You can contact me via the email address, which I believe is in the chat as well as on the slide. And I can pass on questions, comments, suggestions, whatever you like, to the relevant people, and we will work together to try and mitigate this global crisis that we are facing. Let's look after each other. As Martin said, this isn't a competitive sport. This is a situation where we are all at risk, and it is urgent. It is happening now. We can't wait. So please be part of this conversation with us. Help us to help you, to help your colleagues, your children, your friends, your family. Let's work together. Let's get some good ideas, and let's get some guidance out there that will help us all tackle this issue right now. Thank you finally for coming today. I hope this has been useful. I hope you find it interesting. We have another event at 1600 UTC on how we need to evolve our health and safety standards so that we do protect everyone. We've touched on that already today. Different people have different vulnerabilities, different needs, but are we actually getting the message across? Again, back to Daniel and the Colombian stakeholders saying it's all too hard, we don't understand what you're talking about. We need to change, we need to evolve, and we want your ideas. Please do join us. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much, Daniel. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope we do something similar soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.